Okay, in this video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be replacing the exhaust manifold on the antique 1988 Kenworth T600. The reason I'm doing that, I'm going to show you here in a few minutes when I open up the hood. It's leaking, and instead of putting the OEM one back on, I found one from Full Tilt Diesel. I'm not sure exactly where they're at. I'm not promoting them. I'm just telling you where I got mine from. It was up there around $1,800, but it's probably because this is what's called a DDAC1 Detroit 60 series, the first generation. We're going to go ahead and replace this, and I'm going to be jumping around a little bit on the video here to try and make it short for you. There's going to be a lot of jumping around, and I apologize for that, but this is several hours worth of work, and I don't want to put a video out there that's going to be like 5-6 hours. So I'm going to be editing this down, and it's going to seem like I'm jumping from spot to spot a lot, and I apologize for that. Let's go ahead and get the hood open, and I'll show you why we're replacing it. Okay, now we got the hood open. Let's get you guys a lot closer. You see how this pipe here is all dark? When I actually put this pipe on, I had painted it copper. I mean, there's a big difference between the way it looked and the way it is now. I mean, here's a can of copper paint. You can see the big difference how dark this is. Back in here, it's really dark, and it's not so much the camera and the lighting. It's because the exhaust has been leaking. We're going to go ahead and replace this exhaust manifold here with a brand new one that, like I said, I got from Full Tilt Diesel. And you're going to see, one of the things I got to do is take the turbo off. You can see how black this hose is. It's a red hose like this hose here. You can see how black it is from the exhaust leaking. And I don't believe in replacing parts just to replace parts. There's a problem, the exhaust manifold's leaking, so it's got to be fixed or replaced. The high performance one is supposed to help make the truck run cooler, which this truck runs about 180 degrees. These electric fans that I made the shroud for and installed hardly ever come on unless you're under a load. But the new one's supposed to make the truck run cooler, give a better performance, make the turbo spool up better. Well, just stopping the exhaust leak is going to make the turbo spool up better. But one of the things I want to make sure I explain to you is when I take these what's called a V-clamp off, you do not want to lose the nut. Those nuts are hard to come by unless you buy a whole nother clamp. Be careful not to lose those clamps on the nuts on the V-clamps. But this one does not have EGR, it does not have a wastegate. It's going to be a whole lot more simpler than a lot of the other ones out there because they don't have a lot of components on it that the new ones have, which is one of the things I like. And then we're going to be taking this line here off, take this line here off. I'm going to take this off of here and take it off of here. Then I'm going to take it off of here, and I'll loosen it up here and just spin this up out of the way instead of taking that all the way off. But this tube here is going to come all the way off. I'm going to wind up cleaning that back up, repainting it copper. Turbo's going to come off just to get to the exhaust manifold. And I'm hoping we can get around this pipe. If not, then I'll have to move the blow-by tube. I should be able to get around it. If not, it should move a little bit, enough to be able to get around it. Okay, now I got a flashlight here and I got that tube that I was just going to flip up. Gave me a little bit of trouble coming off of here, so I just went ahead and pulled it off. And like I said, I took the tube off that went from here to here, which is laying right there, which I will clean back up and repaint before it goes back on. But with this flashlight, you can see how dark this cell is. I will be pressure washing it. We do have a little bit of an oil leak right there, but when the engine gets rebuilt and in frame, that'll get taken care of. But I want to get the exhaust manifold taken care of right now because it's definitely leaking, because that's the only place that it's going to get that dark around here is from the exhaust manifold. It could be just the gaskets, or it could be the exhaust manifold itself, because these 60 series do have a habit of cracking. They also have a habit of where they're put together right here, because this is they're all 3-piece exhaust manifolds. They also have a habit of leaking right here where they're put together. They make a kit that will go over this and stop it from leaking. But instead of me going through all that hassle, I mean, those kits are a pain. I put them on before. They're a pain to put on. So I just went ahead and bought that high performance. Hopefully it will give this motor a little bit of a boost even before the in frame and after the in frame. When we do the in frame, we're going to be going up on the turbo a little bit to be able to give a little more horses to this motor, because this is only 400. When we do the in frame, we're going to be bringing it up to 450. It don't leave the Atlanta area. It's not a big deal about the horsepower. It's basically almost like a city truck. I got those tubes off. The next thing is get that line off, get that oil drain tube off. Those nuts there that hold the turbo on, I gotta take them off, and I'll get them off, and then we'll have a clean area to work on the exhaust manifold to get all the exhaust manifold bolts off. On this one, it's a fairly simple deal. If I have to move the drip tube, it's just wire tied here. I'll be putting a P clamp on. I'm not a big fan of wire tying things when there's a bolt right here. As you can see, there's a bolt right here for a P clamp. So when I go back with this, I'll be putting a P clamp on this and getting rid of the jerry rigging. I like having things the way they're supposed to be instead of just trying to make things work. The turbos are not light. Once you unbolt it, I don't know what the weight is on that turbo. To me, it feels like about 100 pounds. It's going to be heavy. Once I get that off, then I'll start the camera back up. Okay, I went ahead and removed the oil drip tube or drain tube, whatever you want to call it, because on this particular truck is a hose down here, and that's what it goes into. I unbolted it from up in here, and seeing how it's just hooked on with a hose, I just went ahead and loosened up the hose clamp and took it off. That way it's totally out of the way. A lot of the newer Detroits, they are actually screwed in to the block or the oil pan, depending on which model you have. So this one I just got out of the way. Plus, another reason I took it out of the way is if you see this red stuff here, somebody that had this truck before me thought it would be a good idea to put silicone the turbo, because this bolts directly to the turbo. And I don't know of any silicone or form of gasket, whatever you want to call it, that will handle the heat that the turbo puts out. That's the reason a metal gasket between the turbo and exhaust manifold, because of the heat. Rubber or cardboard gasket will not withstand the heat that this turbo puts out. And like I said, I don't know of any silicone that will handle the heat of the turbo. And when I was taking it off, I noticed it was leaking because somebody decided to put this back on with silicone. Why, I don't know. I mean, these gaskets are not that expensive. If you go to Detroit or Freightliner's a Detroit dealer, you can probably get them for a couple bucks and put one on. Most of the gaskets for the drip tubes are the same, so it's not a big deal to just put a new gasket on. It's the right way to do things. And as you can see up here, I went ahead and I got the feed tube off. I still got to unbolt the turbo. The feed tube on this one, kind of all metal, going down here to the housing for the oil filters. But it's got a flexible braided line that I replaced probably 6 months ago because the line was leaking. I had to go get one made, and they actually had to change the fitting here on this tube because they couldn't make it to match up, and I couldn't buy that tube, that flexible line. So that will move around quite a bit, be out of my way. I can start unbolting turbo. As you can see, I got the exhaust already unbolted, and like I said, do not lose these nuts. They are not easily found. One of the things that I do when I know I'm going to have bolts or nuts or fasteners loose, I'll grab a container. This is just one from the dishwasher detergent, and I'll drop the bolts in, bolts, nuts, any kind of retainers, clamps or anything that I need to hang on to, I'll put in there. That way when I go to put this back together, all the stuff is there. I'm not trying to find it on the ground somewhere or have it be searching down inside the motor. This one's a whole lot easier to work on. There's no EGR coiler here to deal with, which makes it easier. There's no wastegate for airlines or anything like that. It's a simple truck. That's the reason I got this truck, because it's simple, easy to work on. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and unbolt this turbo and get it off. I have run into a bit of a problem. As you can see right here, one of the studs for the turbo broke. Got a nut off the other bottom, But the top two, one up here, they will not come loose. I tried cutting it with a grinder with a cutoff wheel. I can only get so far. I don't want to cut the turbo because I need to reuse the turbo. And then the other one is, that one won't come loose either. So what I'm going to do is, I got an air chisel here. I'm going to try and cut them off with the air chisel because I'm not reusing the exhaust manifold, but I am reusing the turbo for right now. When we do the end frame, we'll be changing the turbo. But I don't want to change the turbo right this moment unless I absolutely have no choice. So if you have this problem, do whatever you need to get those top studs or nuts off so you can get the turbo off, because you have a couple bolts behind the turbo here that you really can't get on there too well. I tried putting a wrench on them. I cannot break them loose with a wrench. Maybe I'm just too weak from all the chemo. I don't know. So I have to get the turbo off so I can use a hand ratchet and a socket to get those two top center bolts off for the exhaust manifold. Okay, well, it's going to get noisy, so I'm going to shut the camera off for right now. Okay, I am making progress. The one that I had cut, it actually snapped off fairly well, and I'm working on this one here. I'm hoping the camera shows that I'm making progress with the air chisel. One of the things I did do, the one stud that's still intact, I put the nut back on it. The reason I did that is when I do get that last one cut off, I don't want the turbo falling. Number one, it might hurt these fins. Number two, it might slice me up because those fins are sharp, or it might cut up a hose or something. It might damage something. So I went ahead and put that one nut back on there, and I'm going to get that nut cut off, and then I'll take this nut back off and pull the turbo. Okay, I got the turbo off. I just left it hanging there because it's going to go right back on here when I put the new exhaust manifold on. So there's no sense in taking this turbo too far away from where it's got to go. But as you can see, I had one stud left. I had to cut this one off. Basically, I had to cut both top ones off because the nuts were just rounding off. And then that bottom one there actually broke off. And then it gave me one heck of a trouble coming off. After I even did that, I actually wound up using an air chisel to go ahead and get a gap in there, and then pry bars to get it off. That's what it took to get it off. And then I also discovered that the bracket had been broke. If you look right here, you can see where it's pretty much a break. It's not that I ripped it. Now up here I ripped it getting it off, but on the bottom it was already broke. But it did not want to come off. I'm not worried about the studs because I'm changing the exhaust manifold. New exhaust manifold came with new studs, new nuts, all the gaskets and everything. I don't have to go buy any new kind of gaskets or anything. Now all I gotta do is take all these bolts out, then the exhaust manifold will come off, and then I clean everything up, make sure the mating surface is all nice and clean on the block, and I'll clean up here on the turbo. You can see how rusty it is. Like I said, it gave me trouble, and you can see the marks that I left right there from the air chisel. Did not want to come off, but I finally was able to persuade it to come off with the air chisel. Some people call it an air hammer, but sometimes you got to do whatever you have to do to get it off. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and take all these bolts off and get the exhaust manifold off. I got all but this bolt here out of the exhaust manifold, and it dropped. One of the problems I'm running into is I have replaced the entire exhaust pipe, muffler, all that stuff from the turbo back. I did not replace the turbo. And when I did, I bolted it all up the way it's supposed to be. If you look back there along the pipe, right there, you'll see where I have it clamped where it's supposed to be. And that created a little bit of a problem. It prevents the exhaust system from moving like it's supposed to stay in place, so it does what it does. But as far as getting this bolt here, and this bolt here with the exhaust manifold up in place, and the pipe not moving, I couldn't get it out, those 3 bolts out with it up in place. Now once it dropped, I was able to get this bolt out and this bolt, but you can see this one still hits the exhaust. So when I go to put the new exhaust manifold in, I got to make sure that I put those 3 bolts in the exhaust manifold before I put it up. Now here's a little trick that a lot of people don't tell you. If you got some string and you go to put the exhaust manifold back up, what you can do is you can put the gaskets that go on the exhaust manifold in place on the exhaust manifold, run a piece of string through the hole here and out through the gasket and tie it in each hole, and now keep your gasket in place. And then once you get the bolts started in the holes, just cut the string and pull the string out. That's a little old-timers trick that a lot of people don't tell you to do. They'd rather have you fight trying to get the gaskets up in place, because there are 3 gaskets. You got one that'll go here, and then you got one that'll go here, and then you got one that'll go here. And trying to put them up in place and get the bolts started and all that is a real pain, where if you just do the string trick, they're already in place. You're not fighting with them, trying to hold the exhaust manifold, getting the gaskets in place, and trying to start a bolt. That way you got one hand holding the exhaust manifold and another one starting the bolts. And like I said, before you tighten the bolts down, just get them started, a couple threads to cut the string, pull the string out. I'm going to go ahead and finish taking this exhaust manifold off, and then I'm going to clean up every one of these surfaces before I put the new one in. Now, something I wanted to show everybody, the new exhaust manifold comes with 2 gaskets, 2 gaskets, 2 gaskets. Well, this one here, this may be original equipment, because it had a single gasket for each one of these. And you can see there's no connecting pieces anywhere that connected the gaskets. So they were actually 6 individual gaskets. And that's one thing with the little trick I was telling you about with the string would really come in handy. Now, looking at this, you can see how black this all is. It's because of the exhaust leak. Now, if you look here, that one was not leaking. That one was not leaking. That one was not leaking. But now you can see right here. Let me get the flashlight in a good place. You can see right here where this one was the one leaking. So what it was doing, it was leaking out and it was blowing everything this way. So that's why everything here is black. Now, if you look at that one, it doesn't have that part here that was leaking. Same thing with the very back one. So there was only one leaking, so it wasn't the exhaust manifold. I was expecting the exhaust manifold to be cracked, but it was actually this gasket right here. You can see even right here how it's black right there where it was leaking. Where the rest of them are nice and shiny, they were not leaking. It was just that one that was leaking, and that means I was losing exhaust pressure going to the turbo, which will decrease the power that the motor has, because you're not getting full spool up on the turbo. You're losing some of the exhaust manifold or exhaust gases out the crack. Now, seeing this, I could just get gaskets and put this one back on, but I got an $1,800 high performance intake manifold. Plus, the other problem is these studs, they'll be a pain to get out. And I would more than likely have to heat these up with a torch to get them out. And I may go ahead and do that later on, because apparently from what I'm seeing, the exhaust manifold is good. So I'll probably go ahead and clean it up and later on heat those up, get those studs out, and hang on to it if I need it, or somebody I know might need one and I have it. I have other friends that actually run these Detroits, and they may be able to use this manifold instead of going and spending $1,800 or $1,000 or whatever they wind up finding one for. I'm not going to throw it away, because apparently it's not the exhaust manifold that was leaking, it was the gasket blown out. Clean all these surfaces on the motor up, and then I want to clean this surface for the turbo up before I even start to try and put the new exhaust manifold on. Earlier I was telling you about how to go ahead and tie the gaskets onto the exhaust manifold before putting it in. I would try to get some white string so it would show up better, but unfortunately all I could get was this brown twine. But as you can see, I tied just the upper holes here to keep the gasket in place while I go ahead and put the manifold in place. And you're probably saying, but with the string there you can't get the bolt in. Well, actually the string's small enough where, as you can see, the bolt still slides right in and right out without a problem. So once it's up there and I get all the bolts started, I can just come right here and cut this twine and pull it out of the holes, and it won't interfere with anything. And the reason I use twine is it's not going to hurt the gasket. It's real flexible. I'd rather use string, but twine works as long as it's thin enough. And I can cut it, pull it out of the hole, bolt it all up, and it never hurt the gasket because the twine or string is softer than what the gasket material is, because these are actually metal gaskets. They're not cardboard or anything like that. And as you can see, this exhaust manifold looks a lot better than that one down there. And like I said yesterday, by the way, this is Saturday. I started tearing this apart Friday. It wasn't the exhaust manifold itself that was leaking. It was the gasket. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this exhaust manifold on and put the bolts in here, and I'll tighten them up. You can look it up on the internet to find out what your torque specs are. I'm going to go ahead and torque these down where they belong. Unfortunately, there's going to be one bolt I'm going to have to do by feel because I'm not going to be able to get a socket on it at all. I'm going to have to do it by wrench. But I'm going to put a socket on all the rest of them, torque them down, so I'll have a pretty good feel about how tight to make it. And I'll go ahead and put a wrench on some of the ones that I torqued down to see how tight it is with a wrench, to go back and get that one single bolt that's all the way in the back that I can't get a socket on. And that's going to be this bolt. It's going to be this one or this one, I'm not sure, but it's one of these two. A lot of people will tell you to use pipe wrench or vice grips to put these studs in, but I don't do that. What I do, so I don't mess up the threads, because you start using pair of vice grips, or you start using pipe wrench, or even a stud retractor in reverse, you take a big chance of messing up the threads. And granted, when you go to put the stud in, or the turbo on, you're going to be tightening down the studs anyways. But what I normally do is I go ahead and I run one nut all the way down the on as far as I can, and usually there's enough thread to put a second nut on there. And then I'll take a second nut and I'll go ahead and put it on there, and then I'll tighten down the second nut to run the stud in. And then I'll put a wrench on this nut and this nut, break this one loose, and then this one will come loose and the stud will stay in there. I actually did get the exhaust manifold bolted up. I'm not going to go any further tonight. I actually had to go get different bolts because the exhaust manifold that came off, I'll show that here in a second. Actually, I took pictures of both manifolds side by side on my phone, and I'll just include it in here. I had to go get new bolts because these bolts that came with the kit, as you can see, are way too long. And that's because you see there's no spacer here. But I did go to the hardware store and I bought 12 new bolts and went ahead and mounted this thing up. And I got it torqued down to the right torque specs. And I put the turbo flange gasket on, and I just started nuts. It's all the further I'm going with it tonight. It's Saturday evening. I'll come back out tomorrow morning. There's a few things I want to do, like replace that valve. I have one inside the truck. As you can see, it's leaking pretty good. So I'm going to drain the antifreeze and replace that while I have all this open to clean a few other things up. But you see how that manifold's made. And then you look at this manifold and you see these spacers for these bolts to go through. If it had the spacers, the new bolts would have worked. But when I called Full Throttle Performance and ordered the part, they told me that I didn't need spacers, just bolts only. So I didn't get any spacers with it. Or if they were just providing me with shorter bolts, that would have worked. But I'm gonna go ahead tomorrow. This is the blow-by tube, and I'm going to clean that all up, paint it. This is the drip tube that goes on the bottom of the turbo. I'm going to clean that up, paint it. And then this here used to be copper and looked real good. I'm going to go ahead and sand that back down and paint it up again. I'm going to paint all 3 of these tubes with copper paint before I put them back on. And while that's all drying, I'll go ahead and mount the turbo and all that, because the turbo's not going to be in the way for the blow-by tube, and I got to have the turbo on there to put the drip tube in anyways. So I'll go ahead and do all that while the paint's drying. But I think this exhaust manifold looks a whole lot better, and unfortunately I had to go spend another 50 bucks for new bolts, and unfortunately they didn't have 12 all the same size. So what I wound up doing is some of these I had to get 5 of them and put washers on them so they would tighten up, because they were just a little bit longer. But in a pinch, I had to do what I had to do. Okay, well, when I get further on this, I'll start the camera back up. Here's something I wanted to mention on this video. When I work on my own equipment, I actually do go probably 10 miles beyond where I need to, because I want it to look good to me. When I went ahead and tore this apart, I had to pull the drip tube for the turbo off to be able to get the turbo off. And I also had to pull blow-by tube off because somebody just had a wire tied, and it was easier for me to get both these tubes off to get the turbo and then take off, or exhaust manifold. Because the reason I pulled this blow-by tube is because it goes right here, and it was easier just to take the one hose clamp off and take it off. I mean, that's all that was holding it on, was this here, right up here at the the valve cover, where you can see that hole right there, and it just went down across in front of the exhaust manifold, and they just had a wire tied down there. I'm going to be putting it back on. I'm going to be putting this P-clamp where they had the wire tie. One of the things I wanted to mention, I have a habit of, when I tear this stuff apart, I clean it down to bare metal, prime. If it's a metal tube, I clean it down to bare metal, prime it, and paint it. As you can see, these 2 tubes now look copper. What I wanted to mention is right here at my thumb, there's an indenture. Well, that indenture was covered up with this electrical tape. Some people call it black tape, some people call it electrical tape, and I didn't know why until I cleaned everything up. There was actually a hole there. Apparently it had rubbed, and somebody put that tape over it. There's no real pressure in this tube. It's just a blow-by tube. And then on the oil return, if you can see right here, there was a problem too. Same thing. There was a hole, and it's just a drain tube, so there's no pressure there either. But they both had a hole in them. They're too thin for me to weld. So what I went ahead and did, because there's no pressure in either one of these tubes, I just went ahead and mixed up some JB Weld, put in here in both of these spots. And you really can't even tell I did JB Weld. You can just see it looks like an indenture or a dent. And then I primered and painted them, and this is what they look like now. And this P-clamp is what's going to hold this pipe where it belongs instead of a wire tie. So I'm going back right. But my point here is, when you're working on your own truck and you're doing this kind of a job, why not go ahead and go the extra couple miles, clean this stuff up? You may find a problem that you didn't know you had, like I found on these tubes, and you can fix them and keep yourself from having a major problem later on. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to go ahead and put all this together. I'm going to put these tubes on and put the turbo on, and I'll show you what it all looks like when I get done. I still got to replace that valve up there, which I'm going to do before I put the turbo on, because it's easy to get to. But check everything out while you got it apart and fix these little minor things. That way you don't have to worry about them later. And if you have access, like that valve right now, I got plenty of access. Go ahead and take care of it while you have all this room, instead of trying to fight to get around pipes and turbos and things like that. And as you can see, I got the both these pipes on, bolted up, clamped down where they need to be. This one has an open end because it's the blow-by tube, and this was leaking, so I went ahead and replaced it, seeing how I was already right here. Paint these for a couple reasons. One, to make the truck look better. Two, if I have an exhaust leak again, even though this is all dark down in here and I might not be able to tell that I have an exhaust leak, with all this stuff being nice and shiny and painted, I will be able to tell there's an exhaust leak, even if it's a slight leak, because it'll all turn black. Right now I'm working on the V-clamp here for the turbo, and one of the things that I do when I put these clamps on, because they can actually be a little bit troublesome, but what I do, you only have to use a wrench or 3 or 1/4 inch socket and ratchet. But while I'm tightening it up, I'll go ahead and tap on it around. You don't have to tap on it a lot, and you'll notice once you tap on it, wrench or ratchet, whatever you use, and tighten it up, will seem like it's a whole lot easier because it loosens up. What's happening is when I tap on this like this, it's actually vibrating everything and allowing the clamp to even out, so it's not just pressure where the nut is, but it evens everything out, and that's why it gets easier to turn. And if you keep doing that until you tap on it, you don't have to beat on it hard, just tap on it. And when you tap on it and it doesn't get easy to turn again, then you know everything's tight and it should not leak. After I get this one tight, then I'm going to go ahead and put the other part of the housing for the turbo on, which will go here, and I'll go ahead and I'm not going to tighten that up. I'm just going to snug it up. And the reason I'm not tightening it up is because that pipe in there laying on the floor, I still got to clean that up, repaint that. And it goes from here to the housing that's going to go on here. And one of the reasons you can take this clamp off and pull this off is you can, what's called clocking. You can turn it to have this pipe line up. So I'm not sure exactly where it was, so I'm going to have the pipe ready to go on when I go to tighten up the clamp that holds it on here, so I know it's all good. I mean, I'm pretty much done except for cleaning that pipe up and just tightening up some clamps. But go ahead and subscribe, click the bell button, and help other people out there to find this channel so they can actually learn how to do some of this stuff and save themselves money. And whoever's watching this, I hope this helps you a lot and saves you a good bit of money. Thank you, and keep watching for the next video.